Even with the most egregious examples of bad comic book stories or writing or characterization, eventually I get to a spot where I'm like, yeah, I think I've said everything there is to say about this particular writer or series. Maybe there's nothing to say about this particular issue, but it turns out when it comes to Tim Sheridan and Alan Scott, the Green Lantern, that is not the case. Every single time a new issue of this is released, he does something even worse than he did in the previous issue. Obviously, we're retconning the crap out of Alan Scott, basically just destroyed his origin in the last issue. And in this issue, I find what he's done far more reprehensible than what he's actually done in the first two issues of Alan Scott, the Green Lantern, which were prime examples of what Mark Waid claims doesn't exist. You know, these things don't happen in comic books. And at this point, I would say the content, specifically two issues with Alan Scott Green Lantern #3, are fireable offenses on the part of not only Tim Sheridan, but I got to give a tip of the cap to the editors. Group editor Katie Kubert, editor Andrew Marino, and associate editor Marquise Draper for what is actually in this particular comic book, the way that Alan Scott is presented after escaping from the insane asylum and seeing what had happened with the lobotomy to that trans person in the 40s or whatever, and what he's doing in his free time when he's not being a superhero nowadays, I think is terrible writing, terrible characterization, and something that you shouldn't do with superheroes, certainly not Golden Age superheroes. But then the characterization of Spectre, who is an interesting character, has power sets that are unbelievably high up there, but actually does have a pretty set characterization, especially if you go back to the Ostrander run in the 90s of who the Spectre is, who Jim Corrigan is. And I would say the way that they use Spectre in this comic book might be even worse than what they have Alan Scott doing at the very opening of this comic book. It's crazy. It feels like DC Comics have lost their ever-loving fucking minds at this point, and they just don't know how to rein some of these creators and editors in and actually do what the homework is for your DC Golden Age homage books to Alan Scott. Obviously, we've also got Wesley Dodds as well as Jay Garrick. I would say the other two books are actually pretty darn good. If you want to see Alan Scott super duper sad and conflicted and moping the entire time because he's gay, but he doesn't want anyone to know that he's gay, this is the comic book for you. If you want to see him standing around talking to people, this is the comic book for you. If you actually like Green Lantern and Alan Scott and the power set and the wonderful world in which he exists, you are not going to like this comic book because that is not what is in here. It's not an homage to anything. And this is Tim Sheridan and the editors at DC Comics taking liberties with the character and just destroying something, I guess, just because they could. Let's get into some of this stuff because it is mind-blowing what they have Alan Scott doing at the beginning. I couldn't believe it. There were some images released showing him hugging the Spectre, and we will get to that. But I just couldn't believe the opening of this when apparently Alan Scott, in his free time, is going down to the docks and soliciting male prostitutes. That's what he's doing with his day-to-day life. He's just a John. Apparently, he's a whoremonger now. Just what a terrible, terrible take on a superhero in their day-to-day life. This is a slap in the face of Martin O'Dell. This is a slap in the face of Bill Finger, the original creators of the character. I guarantee you they had none of this ever in mind. It doesn't matter if Alan Scott was gay or straight or whatever. He wasn't going down to the docks to solicit prostitutes. And along the way, he does find out that maybe his favorite boy has actually died along the way under mysterious circumstances, and that gets our crime noir going. But this is what, in Tim Sheridan's mind, Alan Scott would have been doing in his free time, going down the docks and soliciting prostitutes. And not just a couple of prostitutes, lots and lots of different prostitutes, because a lot of guys end up dead here because they are servicing Alan Scott in his time of need or whatever. Just really crazy stuff. Like I said, I just can't get my head around what Tim Sheridan and Katie Kubert and Andrew Marino were thinking on this comic book story, and thinking that this was a good interpretation of Alan Scott, a good reinvention of the character as a gay man in the 40s. Of course, he would have had to have been a whoremonger. That's exactly who would have been. There was another really weird thing in here, because the Spectre does come into this story, had the potential to be the highlight of the entire book, but this really isn't Spectre. Apparently, Alan Scott is holding a lot of Catholic guilt over his attraction to men and the fact that he's secretly going down to the docks and soliciting male prostitutes. And it certainly would have been taboo at the time. But the Spectre lets him know, you've done nothing wrong. In fact, the Spectre says, he spoke to DC's version of God. He's spoken to the presence directly, and the presence let him know, hey, he's doing nothing wrong. If I didn't want him to love that guy, he couldn't have done it. Which seems really, really strange, especially if you go back to that John Ostrander, the Spectre run, which is basically the blueprint of what the character is, and definitely one of the go-to source materials for who the Spectre is, where he's absolutely depicted as a homophobic individual. He does not like gay men in that series. In fact, I think he goes to heaven, or maybe he doesn't make it all that way. He goes up there and starts talking to like archangels and like, hey, can gay men get into heaven? Because he doesn't believe that it's true. He doesn't believe that could happen. And obviously, that story happens well into the career of Jim Corrigan, the Spectre, after this. What a weird characterization of the character. That's what I'm talking about, fireable offenses. We're talking about editors that don't know anything about the characters, that don't know anything about the history. The weird hug between Alan Scott and the Spectre just feels so out of place just because of who the Spectre is. And another thing, and I understand the way the Spectre and his powers have been presented is wildly differentiated over time because he is so overpowered. He's like omnipotent, but he's like severely strong. But I thought he was like the wrath of God, to where he could sense the sins in other men, not the goodness in other men. And if that is the case and Alan Scott is hiding who he is, how would he even be able to sense it unless it was his sins? It's just kind of weird. Although, as I mentioned, the Spectre's power set has varied wildly over time, but that's kind of the way I understood the Spectre. But this was just really strange. If you're a fan of the Spectre and you bought this comic book because he was on the cover, you don't really get the Spectre in here. This isn't who he is. This is just weird LGBTQ fanfic going back in time and changing who characters are and what they represent and acting like the Spectre's having one-on-one conversations with God about Alan Scott and his sexuality and not realizing who the Spectre really is and Jim Corrigan really is and what the character's history actually is when it comes to this stuff. Just terrible, terrible characterization and writing. And like I said, terrible job on the editorial staff. Obviously, terrible job on Tim Sheridan, who's been doing a terrible job since the day he started writing at DC Comics, so that's no surprise at this point. When we get into the story, the JSA do show up once he starts investigating this young man. I think his name is Jimmy. I don't really know. It's one of the dudes that Alan Scott was banging at the dock for $5 or whatever. Jay Garrick shows up to assist in the investigation, and this part is really weird too. Another black eye on the editors and the writer of this book. So what it feels like, this is the first time any of this information is coming to light, and Jay Garrick is coming in to assist Alan Scott, who wants to kind of be his own man. He doesn't really want to work with other people. And then Jay Garrick's like, oh, yeah, we've been investigating this ourselves. We already even assigned it to another person in the JSA. Why would you have already been investigating it if Alan Scott's the one that discovered all this stuff? Like, it made no sense. And they do end up uncovering that apparently Jimmy, or whatever the guy's name is, the male prostitute that's dead, he's not the only one. There's a host of other male prostitutes that have been killed in the city, and they all have one thing in common. This is one of the things I guess the Spectre does help with, is uncovering that they're all related to Alan Scott. These are all the dudes that he's been banging and paying money to because they're male prostitutes, and they all have that in common, and they all have like a scar or marks on them that are very similar to the guy that ended up on the roof, I think in the first issue. I don't know. Like I said, this comic book's kind of been all over the place. So they do have marks that are similar to Johnny Ladd or whatever, the first love of Alan Scott, the guy that he wanted to marry or whatever when he was in the Navy, because they're altering all of his history and whatever. And obviously that does spark a moment of clarity in Alan Scott's mind. He's like, oh my goodness, I'm at the heart of all this stuff. And the Spectre goes, you love them all, Alan. It's just really strange. A moment there for the Spectre, in my opinion. Everything about the Spectre in this book is just kind of weird. Not just everything about this book is just bad, to be completely honest. The art is serviceable or whatever, but there really isn't any superhero stuff in here. Although I guess technically the Green Lantern does almost fly a couple times. And then we get to the final moment, the final reveal, which we all knew was coming. This wasn't much of a mystery. And I think that was supposed to be what the book is like a mystery, like who is the Crimson Lantern? But as soon as you saw the Crimson Flame and like the dude that he wanted to marry died at the hands of the Crimson Flame, who did you think was going to be the human embodiment of the Crimson Flame? Was it going to be anybody other than the man that he fell in love with? Of course, that's who it is. And I don't know, maybe he's not even American anymore, because the words that he does speak, it appears that he's speaking Russian, whatever. And he does slap him right across the face because apparently he's upset because Alan Scott's been going down to the docks and paying dudes $5 a blowy. And he wasn't very happy about that. I guess he expected Alan Scott to remain true to his word and wait for him to come back because he was his true love. And Alan Scott let him down because he's a whoremonger. And I guess that is the impetus or the big confrontation that is coming up. Perhaps we can actually get to a superhero story sometime after this, but everything leading up to this moment has been lacking much superheroism whatsoever and has really just piled on so much baggage and garbage onto Alan Scott. It's not even funny. It's just a really, really, really weird thing. And I am not surprised that the sales on this particular series absolutely died. Probably in no small part to Tim Sheridan himself going out there and telling people they had to buy it if they wanted to actually support LGBTQ rights or whatever this is. This is nothing more than Tim Sheridan's attempt at a 1940s LGBTQ like gay fanfic book or whatever. It has nothing to do with superheroes. It really has nothing to do with Alan Scott. This is just the Alan Scott that he wishes existed, but it is, in my opinion, just a slap in the face of Martin O'Dell and Bill Finger, the men that created the character, and everyone else that came along after that when it built up the character. Now, obviously, it's been a long time since Alan Scott was the Green Lantern. He's not the best known Green Lantern in DC Comics. There's certainly other characters that have superseded him over that point, but he's all but a dead character at this point. Alan Scott will be nothing more than a Pride cover model moving forward. Whenever they do their DC Comics Pride anthology, you get 8 stories of an Alan Scott story written probably by Tim Sheridan. I wouldn't imagine he's going to get any more DC work after this one, especially with the sales and the fact that he failed so hard, obviously on his Teen Titans Academy as well as the Shazam book. The guy just doesn't know how to write comic books. He's not interested in writing superhero comic books. And that's how we get here. Just what a weird fucking comic book. That's like the only way to describe it. Like I said, every time you're like, no, you can't fuck it up anymore, can you? He's like, nope, it's Tim Sheridan. Do not underestimate the man. He can always pull a new trick out of the hat. In this case, he's talking about tricking down at the dockside and all that kind of weird stuff. And I don't know if you're a Spectre fan. I want to hear from you guys. Is that a good interpretation of the Spectre and who Jim Corrigan is? Because from what I understand and what I've read, I was like, I don't know who the fuck this is. This is just a character that they made up and put the Spectre's like fucking skid on him, because that is not who that character is and hasn't been for the entirety of his existence. But there you go. Another absolute example of all the things that Mark Waid says aren't going on in comic books, and just really, really insane. If you're with me and you're finding it very difficult to stick around and finding the good in comic books, do not give up. I'm not giving up. I will continue to talk about comic books, the good and the bad. If you want some more thinking critical content and some more fun to fill your weeks when you're actually lacking in good quality comic book entertainment, we do have a lot more stuff over on the Patreon. I would recommend you go check that one out. We got over 7 hours of new content every single week, talking about the good, the bad, talking about pop culture, answering questions, all that kind of stuff. And if you're looking for a community to stick around in because you love comic books, but you're not enjoying what's going on right now, I think that is the place to be. Definitely check that out because there is a link in the video description.